With this, it's my great honor to present the next keynote panel chaired by Dr. Claus Jensen. Dr. Jensen is our Chief Digital Officer at Sloan Kettering, and he is going to fascinate us with a great discussion along with the panelists, Dr. Affan, Dr. Jarry, and Dr. Sander, talking about the digital transformation age. I have to say that what I personally like most about Dr. Jensen, Claus' door is always open. And if anything, he came with an amazing, innovative approach that, if anything, it was really a great balance in regard to his perception of the organization and operational culture, and at the same time, without forgetting about the important perspective at Memorial being patient care, research, and education. Claus, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kassan. And I'm going to start with just a perspective on, actually, what did we just talk about? Because we just talked about the fact that COVID-19 changed everything. And I want to, before we go over to the panel, just talk a little bit about, well, what do we actually mean when we say digital in the world of care? And here's an example. Everybody pretty much did similar things, so there's nothing unique here. But these happen to be the things that Memorial Sloan Kettering did to take care of our patients in the second quarter of 2020. You may remember March, April, things got really bad in New York City area, and we had to send people to work at home, and we had to figure out how we handle the most critical patients, etc. So we went to 20 times the telemedicine volume. We beefed up secure communication, not just on our floors, but also between different locations. And we applied analytics to understand who's the 24/7 care team. We sent home office and care coordinators, and now they needed different tools so they could talk to each other because they weren't in clinic anymore. We sent home patients that we knew were immunocompromised, and we weren't sure how that was going to work with the virus. So we had to monitor them at home, and we sent them home with pulse oximeter monitoring. We tried to optimize so that people that weren't working together they normally would, they had digital scribe tools. We allowed non-patients to sign up for our patient portal so they could ask questions about anybody they cared about, and if they were worried on their own behalf and weren't our patients yet, they could ask questions about COVID-19. We shifted to electronic patient consent for as much as we could, as quickly as we could, and there's all kinds of stuff around supply chain analytics. And it's not actually the specifics of the list that matter. It's the fact that we're already moving to new ways of providing care, and digital tools and technologies have become, not will become, but have become fundamental to what it means to deliver an integrated care model in a hybrid healthcare ecosystem environment. So I wanted to use that to introduce the topic, and then I'm going to ask my colleagues to chime in on how digital plays a role in new models of care. So Dr. Affan, why don't we start with you? You're on mute.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Jensen. The way that I'm looking at things right now is, looking at the digitalization. Why did we need to do this? What's going on in the healthcare in general that we needed to use the revolution of digitalization? So if everybody would agree that healthcare is shifting from what we call volume to value. So all those things now moving from quantity to quality. The reason for this is the extra expenses in healthcare that has been completely uncontrollable. Globally, the healthcare is around 7.5 trillion annually. Here in the United States, it used to be 3.5. I think now it's approaching around 4 trillion annually. Everybody came to a conclusion that this model is unsustainable to it with a high cost. So out of this, what emerged were some models of care like accountable care organization, clinically integrated networks, or whatever thing that can help us to control the cost for patients' care, yet bringing some good results and outcomes. So for example, how the digitalization helped with this, and I'm going to allude to telehealth in particular, because everybody knew during the pandemic, telehealth was really playing a big role, at least, you know, and I'm going to give some examples in pediatrics where I practice primary care pediatrics. We were able to do continuity of care when we had a lockdown where our patients were not able to come to our practices, yet some of them had some asthma medication that needed to be renewed or refilled. They had ADHD medication. Some of them are diabetics. We had to be in touch with them. So even if they cannot come to the office, that we had to continue the care. So that was one of the applications, the telehealth, or I like to call it virtual visits, actually. If we take this into other areas in healthcare, we were able to shorten actually the stay in hospitals. So, you know, and thanks for remote monitoring of patients, even after complicated surgeries, those patients can go out as far as we can monitor them, as far as the physician can have a look while they are home and they hooked up to their monitoring devices, then they don't need to be in the hospital for a long time. I think the concept right now of hospitals at home is gaining a lot of popularity, and I heard recently that CMS is reimbursing hospitals that are able to go ahead and do some care for those patients at home. So I think digitalization was a must for us at this point, and I'm happy that, you know, healthcare is moving toward that direction.
Thanks for sharing, and there were great points. One of the things we found at MSK is that you mentioned the notion of a virtual visit. We found that was the easy part. What was harder was to take what was a very integrated delivery model that happens in our clinics and try to figure out how does that multi-person, multi-dimensional model actually transfer to an environment where you're not sitting in the same room, you're not in the same facility anymore. Olivier, I know you spent some time thinking about that. What's your perspective?
Absolutely. And interestingly, we had just a few weeks to solve problems that we were planning to have a few months to solve. Some people would say COVID has concentrated in 100 days, 100 months, maybe, that it would have taken to accept these technologies. Still, there are some issues remaining, including the ones that you mentioned. So regulatory is still catching up. Reimbursement is doing better, but also still catching up. Fortunately, a number of authorities, including in the US, have made a little bit more flexible their reimbursement and regulatory constraints. But your point, Klaus, is very important, which is we are collectively discovering how these new techniques integrate to the flow of care. There was a very interesting quote from somebody at the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. The person was saying, you can disrupt, but you cannot interrupt the care flow. So you can bring a disruptive technology, but if you interrupt what's happening in the surgery room, in the doctor's office, it's not going to fly. They're not going to use it because it's not really helping. So this integration is all on a case-by-case basis. You deal differently with a pediatric case like Dr. Affan versus adherence to tuberculosis treatment, like one of my friends is doing, or many other cases. So this still has to be designed and integrated. But also on the technical side, it's still not granted that your digital system, your telemedicine system will integrate properly with the other system, electronic health records and so on. So we've made tremendous progress in 100 days or 200 days, but we still have a lot to do.
And interestingly, this is going to sound crazy, right? So we're all now coming on the other side of the sort of immediate. Everybody's trying to scramble and figuring out how to handle the pandemic. So now we're looking at, to the point you made, Olivier, how do you make this sustainable? Because it's not like it's only going to be for a month or two. It's probably going to be forever. We went out and looked at telemedicine technology, not just the virtual visit, but actual telemedicine technology that could help us with managing the end-to-end hybrid care model. And we basically came up short. So what we're now doing is we're trying to stitch together different pieces of technology and then wrap our clinical operations around it, and actually spending fairly significant amount of resources building a telemedicine platform out of the pieces for our own purposes. Mark, your setting is a little different. What's your perspective on digital health and technology?
So first, I appreciate the promotion I was given in the introduction. I'm not a doctor, I'm a technologist. But because I'm a technologist, I look at things a little differently. I actually have focused most of my career in pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device, and some short stints in healthcare. One of the things first when I hear telemedicine, and I think you started touching on it, Klaus, when I talk to good friends who are physicians, they tell me, yeah, we're doing telemedicine. And I ask them about the platform, and it's Zoom. Okay, that's a video conference. That's not telemedicine. That's right. Anything I've ever designed, you would have a dashboard that looks like a Bloomberg terminal in my mind. And that's what telemedicine is, where I can see the patient history on the bottom. Maybe I have some telemetry data on the right side. Maybe I can see the prescription history on the left, and I can put my notes in as well as see the patient and interact with them. And I think that's where we're going. And some of the companies that I've looked at have started to do that, but I haven't fully seen it yet. But yet that brings another challenge that coming from the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA regulation we're under that concerns me. One of the latest pushes by the FDA is data integrity. We go to great pains in our integrated systems. And let me, most of you probably have never been in a plant, but let me tell you today, many of them are highly automated and highly digital. And that allows things to happen much faster. I'm actually consulting to a client working on a COVID vaccine, and highly automated, highly digital, and they wouldn't have been able to perform in the months that they have without that. But with that comes a cost and an overhead to ensure that data has integrity, to ensure it's original, it's captured properly, and it's protected. And I think in many industries that haven't had to think that way, they don't always think about that aspect. And that can cause us to take 2 tremendous steps forwards and then 1 step backwards. And I think we need to have that, be cognizant of that and help avoid that. There are things you can pick up from the nuclear industry, defense industry, pharma industry, and principles that they have adopted that can really help ensure that data integrity and that integrity of the system.
So you talked a little bit about this notion of, let me call it the health cockpit, just to use, a term from the airline industry, that, when you're doing telemedicine, you sort of need this cockpit dashboard that allows you to put all the pieces together. That was actually exactly why we concluded that we had to build something ourselves. That, and then the orchestration of the end-to-end process around the virtual visit itself, because there's stuff happening before and there's stuff that's going to happen after, what do you call that, a teledispo or something else. But across all of that, and you were starting to talk about it, there's a lot of data flowing. There's data that we collect during the visit. The stuff we collect before, there might be a diagnostic tests or 2 or 3 or 5 that you have to do before. There might be things you want to follow up on. What role do you think that longitudinal data, which is not point in time, but is, I get this visibility of data for an individual over time and space, what role do you think that plays in how we can build a more integrated experience and ultimately better outcomes?
Well, and I think that's very important. I have actually, as a patient, gone into a hospital out of my normal home region and had the physicians who were treating me not be able to access my medical record, whereas if they had been in a different hospital network, would have had full access to my history. That's painful. It was painful for me in the process because it delayed the proper diagnosis of why I was in the hospital. I also think, having the full background in understanding where that patient's come from, could possibly a procedure, an illness they had 20 years ago is highly relevant to what you're seeing today. You don't have that in many of these systems. And I mean,
that's exactly the hard part, is that whole over time and over space, right? Because we touch so many parts of the healthcare ecosystem and they're not connected at all. In an ideal situation, we can just ask people. I mean, if you're dealing with an adult patient, usually most of us remember, yeah, that happened 5 years ago, that happened 10 years ago. But when you're a kid, that may not be how you see the world. So Dr. Affan, how do you get the full view of all the data that you need to understand from a pediatric perspective? You can't just ask the patient, can you?
Yes, for the most part, actually, and to Mr. Sanders' point, this is really very important for us to have access to the data for patients. I'm going to give you a little bit about, what we do. Seems like, in all humbleness, we're a little bit ahead of the game in our practice here, but this could be a good example for people and futuristically how people are doing things. If you remember, I mentioned to you about the value-based, this is the direction of healthcare in the United States, and assuming risk, from a payment, because I'm coming from the delivery side of healthcare. So with taking full risk with our payers right now, it is a must for us to have access and do analytics for our patients. So our group is part of a big HIE, Health Information Exchange, for the entire state of Florida, as well as we access the portal from those patients besides from the payers, besides having our own analytics teams and our own population health management platform. We are integrating to all the pharmacies that our patients might be going to. We have interfacing to the big pediatric hospital in our area here. So how this all helping us is, we are doing better care coordination. We are able to follow our patients. We get a notification when our patients are in the emergency room unnecessarily, or when they get admitted real time. This is really very important for us to get a chance to educate them, and then we get into the medical errors as well. When you go to different areas and have different interventions happen to you, and you access all of this, you eliminate the errors, and of course the coordination will get you much better care. And I think this is, we will see this now in how we're going to handle the entire globe is going to handle the COVID vaccine. It's a different topic, but I think it's related to the importance of integrating data.
And that's a very good point.
And that's a great outcome. That's the kind of outcome that you want. Talked a little bit about exchanges. What we've found is that exchanges are good for giving you basic connectivity, but we also found that the data means something different in different institutions. So even if you have the physical connection, you may not actually understand the data. So I'm going to turn to you, Olivier, and what's your point of view on semantics of data and what that means for not just treatment, but ultimately therapeutics, because you're making choices based on your understanding of the data in terms of what happens next.
Yeah, I think it's a huge change management program that we are conducting now at the global level. It's probably, as Mark said, many years after other industries. It's like the different stages of grief. There are different stages of change. We did it in the aerospace industry like 30 years ago, for example, for airplane maintenance. And everything was done on paper, and moving this onto data on a computer was, oh my God, you cannot rely on it. You need to have a paper, and you need to print it and have a paper signature of people on it. And then over a couple of years, it was accepted that no, you can do it electronically. So fortunately, in telemedicine, telehealth, telemonitoring, we probably passed this stage now because we have been forced to in the last few months. The next issue in this process is feasibility. And obviously, or semi-obviously, medicine is more complex than aerospace. But there are still many components, many pieces that are not intended to talk to each other. They're intended to be managed in isolation. And hence that calls for the next topic, which is standardization. Before we have standardization and the data can be passed easily, as Mark illustrated, from one hospital to the next, be easily accessible, authorized for access and everything, things will remain isolated, expensive, inefficient, and even dangerous. So it's going to take time in some countries. I think, as you illustrated, Klaus, in the past, countries like Sweden or Iceland or Denmark that are, yes, they are smaller countries, but they are also more under the authority of a national health ministry. They standardize their health records, they standardize the interface. They make it clear that we are universal healthcare, we pay for your health, but in exchange you give us your data. Yeah, it will be kept confidential, but it's very important for these longitudinal studies and the efficiency of the entire system, actually.
I mean, interestingly, Denmark, my country at birth, right, that was where I was born and raised, has 4 healthcare regions inside a small country of about 5.5 million people. 20 years ago, when those 4 regions were building an electronic medical record system, they built 4 different ones that didn't talk to each other. So, and it was not out of any ill intent. I think there was a lack of understanding of how difficult it actually is to create an integrated view of healthcare data. And these days we talk a lot about, ICD-10 and FHIR, and next year it's going to be great. So do you think, Olivier, that standardization is going to solve it? Because I've got personally my doubts. I think it's not just the standards, it's how people use the standards. So it's all about interpretation.
No, absolutely. But it's as I keep referring to a change management program, you need to have a common language and common understanding before you have people talk together. And the system is the same. So if you can define that what is important to monitor a diabetes patient are these 15 parameters, you need to have blood glucose, blood pressure, whatever, or over time, and then you can understand the insulin they use or the other medication they use. And based on this, you can really start running algorithm. If it is not at your hospital, it will be at another hospital, but you see the same data, meaning the same thing in the same way, and you can make similar decisions. So it's I agree with you. It's needed. It's mandatory. It's not sufficient. Then you still need in each respective organization to teach people, to show them how this improves. At the end, the quadruple aim. I mean, it improves medical outcomes. It reduces costs. You don't have to repeat procedures or diagnostics because the data is right here. You don't have to draw blood again for this patient. And it's a better patient experience and better physician experience.
Yeah, so there's a big people and culture component. We'll get back to that a little later in our conversation, but you mentioned diagnostics. So Mark, you're a technologist. Well, that wasn't how you described yourself, but you have a technology background. And diagnostics has always been powered by technology, but it used to be physical instruments that we used to peer into stuff. We peered into humans and organs, and we went all the way down to the cellular level. We understand DNA. We start looking at enzymes inside the cells. And here we are in 2020 and realizing that, well, that was great. But now we had to put all the pieces back together because now you got millions or trillions of pieces. So what do you think from a technology perspective, the future of digitized diagnostics and maybe even what has been called digital therapeutics, which is a hotly debated topic? What does that look like, that future?
Well, I think there's a couple of phases to that, but before we even get to that, something that Dr. Affan said really resonated with me and brought out another point, which is data quality. So when we have all of this data and it's entered by disparate people, whether it's Olivier's point on whether we're using it the same or whether it's purely errors. There's a lot of humans in this process and manual entry. In many industries that I've worked with, we have processes to make sure there is no error in the data that's entered. I haven't seen that as much in healthcare, and I know errors I've discovered in my own records scare me. But that said, the instrumentation and the diagnostics, that's actually an area I work in quite often in manufacturing with pharma companies around analytical instrument integration and full automation of manufacturing processes. And we think of it as Internet of Things almost. You can get the data from these devices directly, feeding into your higher level intelligent systems that are filtering and making decisions or guiding and routing what needs to be done. More importantly, that data quality issue that I'm concerned about, it starts to resolve it because you get people out of the process. That said, when we talked about longitudinal data, I don't just want to know you had diabetes when you were 20 years old. I'm also concerned, can I see your glucose readings over time from back then?
Right.
Why isn't that data available to me? Let me look back. Maybe you had an MRI and there's a piece I want to go back and look at it and it's from 10 years ago. That's the way we have to think. It's not, we're going to have mountains of data, whether I call it big data, whether I call it patient intrinsic data, whatever the right term is, how do I make that usable and accessible by everyone? And then how do I make it easy to use and smarter so that it's pinging me instead of me always having to think and go look?
Yeah, there's this notion of a digital twin model, which becomes a digital sort of model of everything we know about you, and you can start reasoning about it. And that's some of the type of technology that drives diagnostics and therapeutics. So Dr. Affan, working with children, they grew up with technology in a way that you and I can't imagine, because at least I am a little older, and when I was in that age, computers were relatively new, but everybody has devices. They're sort of used to going around computers. Do children take to digital tools for diagnostics? Do they just embrace the kind of therapeutics that teach them things about how they should behave on a device, or how does that work out in your space?
Yeah, actually, this is a very good point. Not only kids, believe it or not, their families. You know, I have to always remember that those millennials and those moms are still young compared to us. And, you know, I love to use the term e-patients, which, you know, refer to those patients are equipped, enabled, and empowered nowadays. So this is really very important, you know, to see. So we use a lot of virtual reality in pediatric arena everywhere. We use it for cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a very beautiful concept of how you get those kids to do the games and play and use all the virtual and the tools, digital tools to help you make a diagnosis, get them engaged. Kids are really very, you know, they don't even like to go to a doctor's office. So leave alone when they are in a hospital, having a big surgery, or, you know, coming for their vaccines or anything. So all of those things happening right now. We're going to see more of this with the COVID. COVID has impacted, unfortunately, kids for years to come with changing their normal life. So there is a lot of areas that, you know, can be working. The only thing that I wanted to allude to, and referring to Dr. Olivier and Mr. Sander, is back to the when we use a lot of technology and we depend on digitalization too much, and losing the human factor and losing the security. The security, you know, I think I mentioned this somewhere else, is, you know, we saw a lot of telehealth visits, a lot of virtual visits. And then after a while, when the lockdown went down, those parents decided and insisted to bring their kids to the offices. And when we were asking why, if you could do the virtual visit, they said, no, number one, I don't want my kid to be on this cyberspace. We don't know the security of this, you know, I don't trust that, number one. Number two is, you know, I want that human factor for my kid. I want the physician to touch every area. I want to listen to the heart. I want to make sure that somebody looks inside, you know. So all of those things, I think we, you know, my point is we need to look at digitalization to be an enabler rather than a replacement for the human, you know, factor in healthcare.
I mean, so you're actually, it's a great point. It's all about the experience, but I have, you know, sadly, I have to admit that personally, I feel that going to the doctor's office is an overrated experience. I don't know that I necessarily want to be there. I have what's called white coat syndrome, which most of you probably familiar with. It's not actually because I'm afraid of being in the doctor's office, because I'm annoyed. I just don't want to be there. Like, I've been waiting for half an hour now. Is my turn soon? So for me personally, being able to do it not in a physical setting is probably advantageous. But there is this human connection, and there's been, like, for the last decade, this hot debate in the industry about whether digital therapeutics are real. You know, we've had the discussions that say, who's better? Is the doctor better, or is the AI component better? What I've seen consistently is that the two together is inevitably better than either in isolation. We've all seen the reports about, you know, this was a scam and this therapeutic didn't work, but last I looked, there's actually hard evidence, especially in mental health and in things like smoking cessation, that digital therapies, this whole notion of gamification and putting a digital wrapper around behavioral change actually works. So Olivier, I know that's something you spend a large amount of time looking into. What's your thought?
Absolutely. And before coming to this point, just a quick reaction. about digitized diagnostics. I would make the difference between connected diagnostics, which are these devices that you may wear on yourself or you may use, like a blood pressure monitor or your Apple Watch. So these are connected diagnostics. So they just generate information. From there, you may have some system that run a diagnosis on it, a digital diagnosis, and Watson was quite famous with it, the Watson system, but it is very difficult. Everybody that has tried it is actually really struggling because the science of making a diagnosis first is very complicated and very subtle. And second, varies by country. Watson was built putting some information from US healthcare providers, and Europeans looked at it and say, that's interesting. That's not the way we do it here. So I don't see really why we should use that. So digital diagnosis, which is behind digital diagnostics, is not easy. Now to your point, Klaus, which is what do we do with this information and what do people do? So digital therapeutics essentially are built on a closed loop on what we just said, which is you measure some information, you do something with it, you make it understandable, you present it to the patient in a case of digital therapeutics, and you expect them to react and to have information by the system that, yeah, if I exercise a little bit more, if I eat a little bit better, I should see a better indication on my connected diagnostic, let's say a blood glucose meter. So this closed loop, some technician, and I'm also a technician, so may see it as, oh, that's okay. You give that to people, it just works. I mean, people are just going to be clever enough to make it work.
No, it doesn't. People will mess up technology any time of the day.
But it does not. Exactly. It's not sufficient. It's good, but it's not sufficient. And with my friends at Dario Health, we quickly realized that you cannot neglect the human factor to Dr. Affan's point and your question, Klaus. People need to be onboarded on these systems. They need to be told, okay, you open the box and then you have 3 parts inside. This part goes on your body. This part needs to be uploaded on your phone and these kind of things. And this onboarding is extremely important. At Dario, we saw an incredible difference with the quality of its onboarding versus competitors, which is great. And then when people start using the system, and especially when something happens in their life, with diabetes, you have different steps. So you are first diagnosed, and then you have to move to a drug, and then you have to move to an injectable, then you have to move to insulin. Each part is a small crisis, and a system is going to give you a cold data, but is not going to help you go through this crisis. So having coaches referring issues to your practitioner, so that she knows that you really struggle with using this insulin and you got a few hypoglycemic events. This is very important. So the technology, everybody would say it, but I think it's always useful saying it is here to serve people, and people need to be absolutely in the loop. Technology is not going to solve it by itself, but it helps a lot.
So speaking of people, Bob has an interesting comment in the chat around the fact that relationships and this whole people-to-people interaction, so how's that going to play out in the future? I do think if you look at the statistics, an increasing number of people are very comfortable certainly maintaining a relationship in a digital setting, but even, and I can see it in my kids, they've got friends they've never met. Now 20 years ago, that was unimaginable, that you would have a friend that you'd ever met in a digital kind of setting. But we saw it happen in retail. We've seen it happen in finance, and it's not completely unthinkable that, at least from a guidance and advice perspective, which always precedes, a diagnosis and treatment, when you get guided on what happens now, that you can see a digital front door to health. An interesting data point is that Google has, I believe it's 1.5 billion healthcare-related searches every day, 1.5 billion. And I'd say most of the stuff that comes back from Google, and look, I've done it, I think we all have, most of it's crap. Mm-hmm. So Mark, what comes after Google? How do we build something that, and I think Google is great technology, but it's a search engine. How do we build something that actually starts giving us a more personalized experience and start learning from what we tell it to get to well, what guidance should I get?
So I think my first response would be you don't. And I'm thinking of a quote from a very good friend who's head of pulmonary at several hospitals, and he will always say, don't confuse your internet search with my medical degree. And I think and having worked a lot with automated systems and trying to deal with clinical trials and looking at biostatistics, the human factor is always important. The machines, when we use artificial intelligence or machine learning, they're only as good as the person who programmed them. So they're doing statistics very quickly, and they're getting through data that a human can't get through. We might look at 10, 12 cases. They're going to look at 100,000 cases instantly. But it's still tainted by the person who programmed it and the confines of what we fed it. So it can't think out of the box. A person can. I'm thinking of another person that I've seen speak at several conferences who talks about cobots. And her point is automation is coming, robots are coming, but they don't replace us. They help us be better at our job and more efficient. So unlike what I'll do on the factory floor, where we do replace people with repetitious jobs, I think when you're looking at medicine, you don't replace doctors and nurses and medical professionals. You augment them and help them see more patients a day more efficiently, and help them maybe be reminded or see things that when they're tired, they might not have thought of, or help present data they might not have access to. And I think it's that assistant, almost, if I look at the Jetsons or Star Wars, it's that's add-on to work with me, that's kind of that assistant, that R2-D2 that's with me all the time, but it doesn't replace me.
I think that's spot on, and maybe I can share an example. It's slightly infamous of that illustrates your point, right? and what the limitation is of machine learning, artificial intelligence. So there was a provider system, it wasn't us, that wanted to use machine learning and AI to try to look at images and get a diagnostic result out of that. So of course they wanted to do the best job possible of training this AI model. So they gave it all the images from their best equipment, and they trained it, and they did a lot of work on it and did beautifully in tests, right? And then they launched it in production, and the results didn't make any sense. And when they started scratching the surface, because AI doesn't explain why it says what it does, it just does. Right? So the model had learned something, but apparently hadn't learned what they thought it had learned, which was find something that had diagnostic meaning. It turns out what they had taught this AI model was to recognize images from a particular piece of equipment, because that piece of equipment was the best piece of equipment that this particular hospital had, and they used the best equipment for the most sick patients. So there was a correlation in the data that was used to train the model between severity of patient disease and the type of equipment you use to diagnose people. And happily, this algorithm taught itself to recognize images from that piece of equipment, which has nothing to do with the diagnostic environment that they lived in. And that's just an example of the fact that unless you're very careful, these machine-trained models only make sense to a certain point, and they don't always come to the conclusion that you thought they did. Having said that,
Klaus, they can be very interesting if you're in a very defined environment. And they are great at processing, as you say, 100,000 records in seconds. And as you know, data science in many countries is called informatics. It's really how do we process this information? And almost opposite to your example, or a positive and funny one, was Dr. Eric Topol of the Scripps Institute was presenting in March at a conference. And he said that they tried something in interpreting images of the back of the eye. And they asked ophthalmologists, if I show you this retina image, can you say if it is a man or a woman? What's the gender of this person? And the ophthalmologists were about 50% right, which is probably the probability out of men or women out of these hundreds of thousands of images. They put this data into a learning algorithm that look at all these images, got it, yes, this was a man, woman, man, and then got new images and was 99% right. To your point, Klaus, the problem is that we have no idea how the machine learned this factor and had to make a decision. The positive part, it was able to find patterns of data and information that a human cannot see.
And actually, I think that's a great point. Patterns that the human eye cannot see. I have another example that illustrates that. I talked to some of our researchers over in the Sloan Kettering Institute not too long ago. And then a peer was talking about the fact that one of the things they're using AI and machine learning for is when you get an image from a cryo-electron microscope and you just look at it, to the human eye, that's like, right? You can glimpse some small deviations in the structure you can see, but your eye doesn't have the kind of resolution and pattern recognition that allows you to really understand. Right? So what the research team does, they applies AI and machine learning so that they can highlight these structures, and then they let the human begin to interpret it. I think that's a little like, that part I think is tangible enough that structure is structure. And you can have the machine learning, the AI model help you with that. It's when you get to the interpretation, to the point you made as well, Mark, that it gets harder. I do think there are things where it's very meaningful to maybe even go beyond augmentation and go to the point where there's certain things that you can probably do guidance around, like what should I even ask my doctor, or what are the additional diagnostic tests that I may need to take depending on what I've told you about my situation, or even something simple like how do I find a doctor in the first place? So Dr. Affan, how do your patients find you, right? And do you think that there's a place here for digital intelligence in terms of helping people find the right doctor to go to or the right facility?
Yeah, I think this is a very nice point that you mentioned here. We do use a lot of digital, social media, all of those things. But what's interesting right now during the pandemic, you know how the restrictions in telehealth around the world with a lot of regulations and barriers that, even in the United States, I can do a telehealth for somebody in a neighboring state. This is changing, and there is a huge concept of an international telehealth exchange, or a global telehealth exchange led by some of the, big tech companies around the world, particularly to just open up all those barriers, because we don't know in the future if something happens like this, a doctor in Denmark can give a consultation for a kid who could be in Africa locked down, or even in the United States here. So I think there is this movement with opening the barriers, making sure that patients will have a good chance to look at a consultant who could be in a completely different area, but he or she would have enough credentialing to help that patient, or feel like this is the right fit for my condition or for my situation to manage my disease. I think this is going to come. It's going to be very tough to do it, but I think the world is ready to have melted barriers between how we're going to conduct healthcare.
So continuing down that route of melted barriers, of increasing access, one of the hallmarks of the academic medical centers and the frontier of healthcare has always been clinical trials. Mm-hmm. And clinical trials have historically been associated with, well, that means I have to go to a particular facility to participate, because that was how it worked. Can you give us your perspective on this idea of telehealth melting the barriers? How do clinical trials show up 2 years from now, 3 years from now? And is there such a thing as a digital/virtual clinical trial? That's for you, Dr. Affan. We'll continue.
Yeah, I think, I have more experienced people who can shed the light on this. But yeah, I think this is, we know for sure that, clinical trials are very expensive, time consuming, and finding the people to do it in a small particular space. Like, for example, in our clinic, if we get into a clinical trial for a particular disease, it's really very tough to even have, especially for rare conditions, to find the 10 patients. But imagine if we opened the barriers and we started to do virtual recruitment and And this is going to be a revolutionary for how we're going to have those clinical trials. It's really very important. I don't want to get political, but I think while people put in other industries, they were more advanced than healthcare, it's time for us to catch up with technology and being able, imagine if we had those clinical trials for the COVID and we were able to conduct everything within 2 to 3 months and have a new vaccine. Till now, I have Moderna in my city here still struggling to have enough recruitment for patients to do the trial or experience their vaccine. So I think we have to move fast in that direction.
I think that's a great point. And before I move on, I do encourage people to throw questions or comments into the chat. And in particular, I'll pick them up as we go down the remaining 15 minutes of this panel. But Mark, pharmaceutical background, right? Pharmaceuticals and clinical trials, they're almost like two sides of the same coin. You're never going to release a new drug without having gone through not one, but often multiple clinical trials. You certainly have multiple phases that you have to go through, or won't even get approved for use. And then you can take a look at the same drug 2 years later, and you might need to run another trial to see if it works on different disease conditions. That's a lot of money. It's a lot of effort. It's a lot of logistics, and it takes a lot of time. Is there a future where virtual/digital clinical trials makes that part easier?
In that aspect, there absolutely is. First of all, Dr. Affan talked about recruitment earlier. I have seen some pretty progressive companies that have used digital technology to seek out patients in rare disease states successfully, just through social media and other venues. So it's already in use there. But I'm thinking bigger, and my background before I was in IT, I actually was in manufacturing and one point in my life, I ran the clinical supplies manufacturing and packaging distribution facility for one of the large pharma companies. And what goes into it and the lead times and the expense and getting the material to the physician's offices, and now as we're getting the biologics that have storage conditions, many of the COVID vaccines are -70 storage, it becomes even more and more difficult. But one of the thoughts I've had around using technology, 3D printers, if we wanted to have people in disparate parts of the world and enroll them in our trials, if we could ship them a box that has a PC, a 3D printer, my active ingredient in the spools, both, frankly, all three aspects of the trial, all arms, so I don't even know what it's going to print. So blinding becomes even better than we are today.
Right.
And then the computer spits out when they log in the morning, it makes their pill. It makes their medication for them. I think that would solve a number of problems. One, cuts down the expense and the lead time to get things out there. It also gives you better compliance and data on your patient compliance, and also where you are in your arms and what's being tolerated while still maintaining the blind. And more importantly, with the COVID, you mentioned a few companies who, if you follow the press, had trouble hitting a disparate population in enrollment. If I could ship this around the world, it becomes much easier.
Yeah, logistics is such an important part of clinical trials, certainly the drug-based clinical trials, but even the ones that are things like watchful waiting. We have some clinical trials that are looking at the effect of exercise on cancer tumors. One of the things we did successfully, but it was done as an emergency, and I think we have to figure out how to do that within both regulatory compliance and also logistical scale, is we actually did start shipping oral drugs to many of the patients we had on clinical trials. Olivier is nodding, because we had to. That was just how you continue to carry on your clinical trial. You can't just stop. These clinical trials last for years, and you can't put them on pause for 2 months or 4 months or 8 months. Do you want to comment on that, Olivier?
Yeah, I'm glad that both of you bring the topic of logistics. When somebody thinks of clinical trial, they may think, oh, the person is in a bed in a hospital and we are going to check if she has a rash or if she has digestive issues. But this is not the reality. The reality is it's a huge number of patients. They are more and more decentralized, especially now. And it's a huge number of functions that are associated. So it's not a small experiment. It's actually a large-scale experiment of the entire way of delivering this care that will happen once the drug is approved, which is just amazing. So when you start finding side effects, for example, you start defining how will I manage these side effects? Will I ask the patient if they feel that they have a bout of diarrhea, they should actually show up at the hospital because this may be the first sign of something much worse as a side effect of this drug. So these trials involve a lot of data. I think Dr. Affan mentioned recruiting the patients, recruiting a diversity of patients, you said, Klaus, communicating the instructions to these patients. They may have many questions, they may be anxious, and a digital tool may actually help them read or understand better or ask the questions in the middle of the night before they call somebody else. Both of you mentioned the supply chain, which is actually extremely complicated. As we speak of mRNA vaccines for COVID, they need to be kept at an extremely low temperature, which is already having many people scratch their heads. How can I manage this hyper low temperature down to the delivery to a patient? You have to ensure adherence to the protocol of the trial. If you lose patients in the middle, each patient is extremely expensive. You lose them before they finish and before their data is available. It's a huge loss in the entire trial, scientifically and financially. So you may have to recruit 1,200 patients because you need 1,000 in the end. If you can keep them and recruit less, it's way more efficient and you can dedicate your money to do something else. And the last point is it's a lot of data to collect. And obviously, if a patient was in a hospital, there are protocols to do that. But if they're at home, they have to report themselves their outcomes. So either that connected device, connected diagnostic, or they enter manually inside the system. But this can offer also a convenience that is better than having a nurse calling them or them sending a paper or keeping a paper log of what happens or whatever. So I just wanted to illustrate these are many, many modules. Every one of them used to be done manually. Every one of them now is automated and starts to be integrated into incredible decentralized clinical trial system.
And it does include, to your point, and they were great points to make, is both the compliance to the protocol for the trial, but also the patient-reported outcomes, right? So it has to be a partnership that we have the ability to extend from the physical world into the hybrid and maybe even to the digital world. And a lot of that is, in some ways, dependent on regulation, because there are still barriers in place for a physician in New York to see someone, even via telehealth, in a different state. So while the regulatory process is, I guess, on standby, right? At least for the future, while the pandemic crisis is still happening, it's too early to tell what that regulatory environment is going to look like 2 years from now. And in some ways, everything we've talked about is dependent on that. And ultimately, if you start talking about digital therapeutics and different ways of getting approvals for therapies, there's an FDA role as well, and they've got pretty strict guidelines on what constitutes proof that are rooted in the physical world. So all these control functions in the healthcare ecosystem have to evolve as well. So on that note, Dr. Affan, we're talking about the future here, and it's a future that in many ways is already here. What do you think is next in digital healthcare? What's your top three?
I think the evolution is going to happen. I think safety for me is really very important. That's one thing very important. The second thing is, and I'm going to be a little bit biased because of how my profession is. I don't want the digitalization to take two things: the human touch. And then in a growing kids, when you were mentioning about digital friends, this is something that we need to our kids not to lose their social skills and everything like this is really very important. And now education is through digital, all of those things. So those are things that we really have to be. But I think security, and safety, and how to use this, and hopefully I want to see the globalization and and I think the challenge that's going to be really right now is the logistics that we have been talking about for distributing this COVID vaccine worldwide. This is going to be a huge digital logistic examination for the entire world, how we're going to handle this, you know, and I hope that the scientists and inventors and, you know, people who are in this field will come up with quick solution that we will be over this pandemic and go to the next step in our life.
Great points. Mark, you're next. Your perspective on what's next in digital healthcare, your top three.
So just a comment on the distribution in cold chain. A lot of that technology exists today to monitor it and real time and react to make that safe. Doesn't exist everywhere in the world, but the technology does exist. I guess my top three would be true telemedicine, as we spoke about earlier, with that digital dashboard for the physician. Although one of the things that concerns me there is, digital dashboard. The other is more use of AI, but selective as that cobot. I don't think you can ever replace the person because I have a lot of concern over people don't always report accurately. So when you have a computer asking me the question, I may take it out of context and not answer it as a patient correctly, whereas a trained physician with experience is going to know the difference. And I don't know that a computer will ever get there, at least not in the next several years. And then I do see changes in the way we do clinical trials. I heard some concerns and saw some things in the Q&A around the FDA approval process. The FDA is already using technology to do virtual audits. So that's already here, and they're not waiting.
So we're not quite at the science fiction level yet, but there are certainly things underway that is moving us towards more of a hybrid fusion, right, of physical and digital. Olivier, your top three, what's going to happen the next couple of years?
So I'm an optimistic by nature, and my top three will be the top three reasons why I feel optimistic about the positive evolution of digital health. The first one is it's clinically proven. Everything which is not bringing a clinical advantage will be weeded out and will disappear and should disappear. So the good thing with digital health is that all the facts are here by nature. It's all digital, it's here, you can observe them. You can observe your 30,000, 40,000 patients using your app or using something in a function in your hospital. So as long as we prove the efficacy of these systems and processes, first, and second, that they reduce the risk of an infection in the hospital that you may acquire if you just make a short visit for something else, and then you end up with an HAI, or it reduces the risk that your mental health app, because it has been certified, creates a huge or bigger mental health issues for you. So it has been clinically tested, it has been proven that it's reducing risk on your mental health as it is. So it's a second reason why first and second would actually help regulators accept these more and more. Regulators just want to minimize the risk and deliver value to people. And these two things, increasing efficacy and reducing risk and increasing safety are what regulators are looking for. The third reason to be optimistic is that these are saving money, all kinds of money. We speak of, we are working with a company doing holographic telemedicine. So now it's an experience where you don't have any difference in the movement of the lips versus the sound. You have a 3D experience of a doctor in front of you. She can show you a 3D scan of your heart or something at a distance without you traveling, without her traveling. It's more efficient and it saves money. And because it saves money, I'm sure that the payers, public payers or private payers, will also be more and more attracted to it. So for these reasons, we started by saying, yeah, there are barriers of reimbursement and regulatory. Actually, because of the quality of these solutions, I think these barriers will go away.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about and what does give us good reason for optimism is the compression of time. It's how quickly these positive changes are actually happening, and it's something that perhaps nobody had imagined how quickly it was possible to move. There are these moments in time where It truly is time to reimagine the art of the possible. MSK has been around for 136 years. That's like 5 or 6 different generations of healthcare technology. And there's just been these pivotal moments where the world shifted completely. My personal belief, we're at one of those. And we're only at the end of the beginning. And I hope for our audience that we've illustrated that things are already happening, but it's not at the end of the journey, we're at the beginning of a journey. This whole notion of digital transformation of healthcare, it's not a destination, it's a journey. And even as we get to everything we talked about here, there'll always be the next frontier because we'll keep evolving the art of the possible and the fusion between physical and human mechanisms for helping people stay as healthy as possible for as long as possible. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Ghassan and Renzo. Thanks everyone for joining.
And thank you all. That was really very interesting, informing, and so much appreciated by the number of chats and tweets that I've already seen.